Welcome, everybody, to another show of Barnyards and Backyards Live. I'm Jeremiah Vardaman with the University of Wyoming Extension. I'm an extension educator located up in Powell. We're so glad to be bringing you a great topic again today. But before we get into that, we're going to get into some introductions. My co-host today is Micah Most. Welcome, Micah. How are you doing?
Hey, Jeremiah. Doing well, thank you. How are you?
Doing good. I'm glad you could join us. We have two guests today to present for us. Everybody on today is UW Extension. So Micah is out of Johnson County. Our guests are Brian Sabady and Donna Hoffman. Brian is out of Casper. Geez, I switched it up on you guys. Sorry. Brian is out of Laramie, Albany County, and Donna is out of Casper in Natrona County. So welcome, guys. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah,
Thanks
thank
for
you.
having us.
Try to butcher it. At least I got your names right. So you may hear her, but you will not see her. Jenny Thompson is the person behind the scenes that keeps us connected and running, also monitoring Facebook. She's behind the B&B logo, so we really appreciate her. She keeps us all together and functioning and getting these programs going. So we're really excited about that. Thanks so much for all you do, Jenny. Really quick, some ground rules here to help you interact with us before we get into the program. So if you're new on the Zoom, you need to roll your mouse across the bottom. At the bottom, there's a chat box or there's a Q&A box. So please type in any comments or questions that you have. Mike and I will be watching those and bringing those questions forward as we can into our session and try and get those to you. As I mentioned, Jenny is also watching Facebook Live. And so if you're on Facebook Live, please put your questions or comments in the chat or in the comments box there on Facebook. She'll watch those and bring those forward, and we'll try and bring those into the show as much as we can. And so with that, I don't think I missed anything, but let's get started. I'm going to turn it over to Brian and Donna. And today we're talking about trees and tree care in Wyoming.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremiah. So yeah, we're here to talk about trees, some care, some tips and tricks that we have. So all those sorts of things. So just like Jeremiah said, Donna and I want this to be interactive. So, anything that you have questions on, please let us know so we can chat about that. So I think Donna and I both end up with different questions or different issues that happen, but we also end up with a lot of the same issues for why we have trees that are doing well and trees that maybe need some extra help. So we're hopefully going to go through some of those things today. So here's kind of what we plan to cover. Donna and I are going to kind of split things up a little bit, but we'll also kind of go back and forth here. So as we're going back and forth, if you have questions, let us know. So based on the amount of time we have, unfortunately, we will not go over pruning, insect issues, or disease issues. But hopefully by covering what we will cover, these will hopefully help take care of some of those things as far as what's going on for, making sure we have proper care. So proper watering, planting, fertilizing, and then just some general care is going to be some of the things we're going to cover today.
And I'll just interject that if you do have questions on the pruning, the insects, or the diseases through the growing season, we do have extension offices in every county in the state, and we are here to answer those specific questions, but sometimes they do get very, very specific, and we want to make sure that we answer each one individually.
Yeah, it's a great point, Donna. So yeah, just because we won't cover them, we are out and about. So so here's just a few reasons for why we might have trees, right? You may also have other reasons that you have trees on your property, but there's a lot of benefits to having these things. I feel like with the current winter conditions we have, we're probably thinking about wind and snow catchment for a lot of places, and probably some good habitat for wildlife as well. So once we get towards the later parts of summer, we might be thinking about shade for when it's really hot. So but it probably goes without saying, the reason we're all here talking about this today is Wyoming is a challenge, right? We end up planting a lot of our trees in a place where we don't natively have a lot of trees growing, right? For some of us, we may on our property where we at have some natural trees or native trees that are growing. But for a lot of the places we plant them, they're not usually there. So obviously we're cold, it's dry, we have little precipitation and low humidity. Things dry out really quickly. We can have poor soils, right? So sometimes we may be in an urban setting and everything's already landscaped and we're really not sure what that soil looks like. But there's a chance that maybe it wasn't the best soil for planting trees. I think all of us in extension can agree we get lots of calls about predators, things that are trying to eat these things, right? Lots of times it might be so dry that our trees are some of the green things that are actually out there that we can actually have for plant or for animals to eat. So our wind can also be tough, right? And we also have some pretty big temperature swings, right? I know Donna, we've talked about this in the past with sometimes we have sick looking trees later on in the year. Might be with some of our conifers or evergreens, but lots of times it's some of those really big temperature swings that can be really detrimental. So
Yeah, this
Well,
winter
and just
Casper had a 42 below, and I'm not relishing the idea of finding out what may not have appreciated that temperature drop this year.
right.
Well, and I think all of us around the state, but we get a lot of those questions about this time of year, especially with evergreens, right? We might start seeing as they're coming out of winter dormancy, they're starting to dry down, browning of the needles, dropping needles, things like that. And people are like, oh gosh, what's going on? But alludes to exactly what you just said, Brian.
Yeah, and so with that, as we think about trees that we have to find trees that not only can handle kind of our short growing seasons and our cold temperatures, but we really also have to think about those really low temperatures, right? So you'll see charts like this, a plant hardiness zone map, and I think these are great. But it's also really important to connect with maybe your local extension office or a gardening club or your master gardeners, whoever it might be, and really talk about what are some trees that do well. You might talk to your conservation district or even your city arborist. What does well in your area, because sometimes these maps are not always that specific, right? So if we look at this map from the dates when this was collected, we see that Laramie is like that zone 4B, but after this map was made, I know there's several occasions when we got to like -39 or -40, and so that obviously puts us more in that 3A zone. So so sometimes just kind of knowing what's around and talking to some of the folks around in your area is really important as well. But with this map, or what we're trying to do is find trees that can withstand that lowest winter temperature. So it's not those 3 weeks where it's between 32 degrees and 10 degrees, right, that we're really worried about. It's that 48-hour or 72-hour period where we between -20 and -35 below or something like that we really have to worry about with our trees.
And then a lot of times with that, go ahead, Donna.
One of the really interesting things is that we can, though, create microclimates in our landscape. So the landscape that's in that picture, dependent upon what the material the house is made of, what material the walkways are made out of, there may be areas in the house in a particular yard that you may get by with something that's hardy to a higher zone, even though you have areas that are fully exposed and have to abide by those lower zone numbers.
Well, and I was just going to add that as you were talking, Brian, at least up here in the Northwest, and I think it's fairly common for the whole state, when those cold temperatures move in, they also come with a lot of wind, and that affects the tree as well. But yeah, we got to look at that. They got to survive the coldest temperature, or else we're never going to have trees.
Right.
Right. Yep.
Hey, Brian, real quick, I have a question. If you're in a community that's pretty rural or pretty remote and you might not have access to the resources like a city arborist or something like that, would it work to just even drive around and look at what's growing and what's thriving and what's not? Do you have any recommendations there?
Yeah, I think you can do that. I guess I would really still, suggest talking to your extension office. We should have somebody that's familiar with where you're at and should be able to recommend something for what you have. But you can do that. I think one of the hazards sometimes with doing that though, Micah, is sometimes in some areas we have pretty low tree diversity. And so there's certain issues that come with some of those trees. I think Donna would maybe agree with me on this. If we look at the city of Laramie, we tend to have a lot of blue spruce and we tend to have a lot of cottonwood trees. And both come with their own specific issues. So they are fairly well adapted, but as far as, care and maintenance for a lot of those cottonwood trees as they get older, we have some pretty major issues. They can be pretty rough on sidewalks for buckling sidewalks and things like that. So there are options, I think, by going around and looking, but I probably would suggest talking to somebody as well with that. So.
Jenny's been putting in the comments that the conservation district is a really good place to talk to someone about varieties of trees that might be underplanted in the area. We have Wyoming State Forestry across the state, and they also have some good insight into what trees are suited for the area. And the state does also have a community forester who does travel across the state and do programming, especially around Arbor Day. State forestry is another resource. And then some of our communities across the state also have USDA national, the U.S. Forest Service. So there are other resources, and checking around with local nurseries. We also have some really great resources of people in the green industry who are very knowledgeable about trees for a particular area. So there's lots of ways to find out what trees might be worth trying. And we all want trees to succeed when we do plant them, but we also need to maybe try some trees. And if we try them at a smaller size, maybe we can find out if they are suitable for a community where nobody has tried them before, without expending a lot of money to start with. But not every tree that we plant is also going to make it. So some of that investment is in trying new things and experimenting with some diversity.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm glad you pointed that out, Donna. I mean, there's so many options for other agencies and resources out there, and they're all really knowledgeable and really helpful. So, and they can also help you, with some of these things about what we're going to talk with right now is once we've maybe have selected a type of tree that we want or a species, where do we put it in the landscape, right? So that can be a little bit challenging sometimes is, finding the right tree for the right location. And I know, Donna, you do a lot with this, with folks, for finding those right spots, finding a spot where maybe we do have some, a microclimate that's going on, maybe making sure that if we have a species that, likes really wet soils, that we aren't putting it somewhere on a slope where it dries out and it's south facing or something like that. Those sorts of things can be really important. So, taking advantage of what you have is really important when it comes to design as well. One thing that you can do, which is kind of an interesting tool, is you can go through and use this iTree design. Basically, it's a website where you can find your location of your property. You can select species that you'd like to plant, and then you can actually go in and it will do an interactive time lapse of where you can expect the actual tree growth for your area to look like over time. So that's kind of a cool deal to make sure, okay, I want this tree, I want it in this area, but is it going to crowd into my house? Maybe looking at some research, do I have power lines that are there, other things like that? How much shade is it going to provide? All those sorts of things are important. So this is kind of a cool thing to use.
I really like it because it uses Google Maps, and you actually are looking at a bird's eye view of your own address when you're looking at planting. I've never tried it for a new property where there's nothing there to start with. But I'm sure that Google Maps has those rural areas for new subdivisions where you're starting from scratch. But it has been very helpful in selecting just the right spot for a tree. I've planted a couple trees where I thought, maybe I'll put it here, maybe I'll put it there, and then tried that iTree design and thought, oh, I need to put it here because when it gets mature, I don't need a problem with the eaves of the house or, as you said, the power line. I don't need the roots right over a sewer line. So it's very interesting tool to work with, and it is great to see the progress of a tree in time lapse as it gets bigger through to its maturity. And we do want to remember to plant trees based on their mature size, not on their cute baby size.
Right.
Yeah, that tree spacing is a big deal, right? And it's hard to have that vision moving forward, but what a great tool.
Yeah, it's a great deal. And then as far as some other things that you can think about, we do have these options as well, right? So these are all found on the Barnyards and Backyards website. But we have some great bulletins that go through, different types of trees that you might find and might select based on where you live. So you can go through this publication and then also go back to where we were just looking with the iTree design or just mapping things out, sketching things out. It can be really nice.
Yeah, just a piece of paper is a great way to get started.
Right. And I think Jenny's just put those in the chat, so you can check those things out. So you'll be good there. So yeah. But this is what the website looks like. This is what you're going to want to click on to where you can find those. Okay, I'm going to take a bit of a break here, and I'm going to turn it over to Donna. We're going to talk a little bit about planting new trees, and I think this is really important, right, Donna? Because we both end up going to places and looking at trees, and sometimes we just have things that haven't been planted correctly, and 5-10 years later, trees are still suffering, and we're still dealing with those things. So,
yeah, I actually have a dried specimen of a tree, or actually it's a shrub, but woody ornamental, and it had been in the ground for about 8 years. When it died, they dug it up, and basically the whole thing just looked like it's just came out of the 1-gallon container and never spread from there because the roots were still kind of going round and round inside what would have been the container, even though the container had been removed. I also have a dead tree stump, just the trunk of it, where the nylon, the orange nylon tie was never removed at the base of the tree when it was stuck in the ground, and it basically became a noose around the base of the tree as the tree trunk got bigger and bigger, and eventually cut off the water supply and nutrients from the root, as well as not allowing the sap to flow back down and provide photosynthate for the tree roots to store in the woody portions of the tree. So it choked itself off because part of the man-made particles were still left in place. So when you're looking at planting new trees, they basically come a few different ways. We start out with bare root, really young trees. So the one in the picture here is a bare root tree. It's shipped usually with some sawdust or shredded paper. It's a really great way that some resources use shredded newspaper as a recycled product to keep the roots moist when they are shipped. Then we get larger trees that are field grown, and when they are dug to be sold in the retail trade, the root ball is balled and burlapped, so they dig up a ball-shaped root system, wrap it in burlap. The one on the right there has a nylon type twine tied around that burlap to keep the root ball in place. And the one on the left is one that has been put into a metal basket to keep the root ball intact as it was lifted out of that spot. And again, everything that we plant, when we plant a tree, we need to remove anything man-made, and everything that goes in the hole should be naturally occurring in relation to the tree that we're planting.
Now,
And then-
hold on, Donna.
yeah.
Now, when you're saying that, like, we hear conflicting answers of that in the tree world, right? And
Sure.
so we hear those kind of things of, and I've heard it before too, and I'm sure you have, of we can plant those metal baskets or the burlap sacks, but you're specifically talking for our Wyoming area, our Wyoming climate, our soils. We have to get rid of all that because it's not going to go away.
In our dry environment, the burlap can actually wick moisture from below the tree, around the tree roots up to the surface and evaporate it away. And so it'll actually dry out the roots if any of the burlap is exposed at the soil level. And much of that advice is given based on arborists, tree planters, landscapers' experiences back east. In acidic soils, that burlap is likely to break down much, much, much faster than it ever will in our alkaline soils. And I've never lived and planted trees in a soil that's acidic. I don't have any experience with how fast that burlap biodegrades, but I have had sample after sample come to the office, or I've gone out into a yard and with permission of the homeowner, dug around and found chunks of burlap still remaining. I found pieces of metal baskets that have choked off roots. And so my rule of thumb here in Wyoming is, if it is man-made, it doesn't belong in the hole with a tree that you plant.
Perfect. Yeah.
So, yeah, the balled and burlapped, and then we have containers, and containers are so much more popular in the horticulture trade right now. They're easy to transport, they're lightweight. People know what size they're buying based on the container. But as you can see on the right-hand picture, when the plants are pulled out of the container, oftentimes those roots are encircling the root ball, and they will continue to grow in that circular fashion. They've kind of developed a pattern, and if they are left in a container for too many seasons, they can just fill that soil root ball area with a mass of roots and consume all of the nutrients that are in that root ball when they're containerized. So when you plant those, there are some things you need to do to make sure that that tree will thrive later on and not just choke itself off and stay as if the pot was still there, even though we remove it when we plant them.
Donna, we just got a comment. Thank you so much for these pictures about what the root balls look like when the tree died. They're very interesting and a really good demonstration.
Yeah, it's you know, you'd think that the tree would grow in its own best interest, but when bad patterns are allowed to continue, trees don't always grow in what would be in their own best interest. So Brian has collected some great pictures of what to do when you're planting things. I like to soak the the bare root in a bucket of water overnight for 24 hours before you plant them. You want that root system to be in as healthy a condition as possible when you put it in the ground, because usually we spend a lot of effort planting and then we walk away from it and don't necessarily think about it 14 hours, 24 hours, 36 hours after we've planted it. And we want to give it that best start that we can. So making sure that it's very hydrated before we start in our dry environment is super important. So soak that root ball ahead of time. And then the picture at the bottom is the one that I use to kind of describe to people what we want to do with our planting hole. We want to make sure that the hole we dig looks like a shallow saucer soup bowl kind of thing, where it's wider than it is deep. And we never want to dig so deep that the root ball could collapse or settle in the deepest part of the hole, which would take that root flare or the crown where the roots begin to flare off from the trunk below the grade where the tree is planted. We want that root flare always at grade or just a little bit higher. So you want to make sure not to dig too deep, which would allow that tree to settle and sink into the hole, taking that root flare below the grade level. So dig your hole wide and shallow. Some of the holes in some of these diagrams show a hole that is just as wide as the root system, but 3 to 5 times the width of the root ball is super important, so that you give the root system a good opportunity to spread out in a soil that is not compacted, and it eventually will grow into the native soils surrounding it. Just to mention it, there is some disagreement or divergence from what's the best plan. Do you amend the soil? Do you not amend the soil? And for years, we put a bale of peat moss in the soil every time we planted a tree. And then the thought process was the trees are eventually going to have to grow into the native soil, so you need to give them tough love and don't amend the soil. And then we said, if you're going to amend the soil, maybe you need to amend the entire site or don't amend at all. And there are some good thought processes in each one of those planting processes, in each of those plans in putting a new tree in. And currently the research seems to be indicating that the trees are best off if you dig that really wide hole, give the tree roots a chance to expand out into the native soil. Don't leave a hole kind of like what we see in that image above where it says step 1, where it's straight up and down and the shovel has polished off the sides of the wall, because when they reach that polished off edge that the shovel can create, those roots may feel like they are in a container and just start to circle inside that hole. So we want to create that shallow root system hole for the roots to be able to expand out in the native soil beyond our planting hole, and not amend is what we're recommending now. So plant a wide, shallow hole and not adding organic matter to start with. And then we will talk about mulching later on, but mulching will eventually add organic matter to that soil as microorganisms and wildlife and critters move around in that soil. So you want to place your tree in the hole and then spread the roots out so that they don't want to just encircle themselves and eventually form a root system that will choke itself off.
Yeah,
so-
Recommend slightly tamping, maybe, pressing your foot on it, but I usually just recommend watering so that all of the air bubbles escape and the soil that you put back in the hole settles into the hole right around the root system. Sorry, I interrupted one of you.
That's okay, Donna. I just wanted to point out that, like this picture, for example, this hole is not a great hole, right? And
Yeah.
what's deceiving with a lot of these bare root trees is when you get them, it's like, oh, well, there's not much there. But then when you actually go to spread them out, or even with these container plants like we're talking about, there's a lot more there than sometimes what meets the eye. So I think really getting a nice big hole, because I've gotten to this where I'm planting a lot of trees and I get lazy and I end up just having a hole that's not quite big enough. And then you've got a tree where it's like, I got it out of the water, it's drying, I'm trying to plant it, but I need to redig the hole. So spending that time to get things planted correctly the first time is really important.
Yeah, one thing I might recommend with bare root trees is to leave a little bit of a cone at the base rather than scooping it all out. And that gives you something that you can support that tree root system on, and it will encourage the roots to spread from the trunk out in all directions. So, you know, if it's got a root that wants to grow straight down, that cone might not be really feasible. But if the roots are already trying to flare out, you could just leave a cone like is in the picture there in step 2, and then spread the roots out over that pile of soil, and then fill in over the top of the root system.
Well, and the thing I would mention, and I think you guys are talking about it, but I just want to make sure I say it clearly for everyone. But the two things that you guys have just covered is the number one success for your trees, right? Setting those trees up for the longest life that they possibly can have. And that is selecting the right tree, putting it in the right location, but then planting it properly. Because if we do those things wrong, we can't fix it moving forward. We have very limited options, very limited management. So if you want to get good trees and have wonderful trees on your property, these are the two things you got to focus on the most for the betterment and the best situation possible for that tree moving forward.
Yeah, especially with, we're still on the slide for bare root, but if you're doing a balled and burlap tree, those trees are not lightweight. You don't want to redo this. You don't want 3 weeks down the road to think, did I do this right? Did I do that right? Did I leave something in? Did I take something out? You want to put that tree in the ground and let it start growing.
Great.
Yep.
So we're on the balled and burlap. Anything different here, Donna, than what you've covered already?
Just to reiterate, if it is a man-made material, it needs to come out of the hole. Again, I would recommend a wider, more shallow root system than these pictures indicate. And I would not loosen the soil under the ball where the root system is. I would just try to get the hole dug just the depth of the hole. I oftentimes will use the height of the shovel and hold it up next to the root flare to figure out how deep the hole needs to be, and not dig it any deeper than, you know, my hand on the handle of the shovel to say that the root system is this deep, and I don't want to dig my hole this deep. I want to dig my hole this deep if the root system is that tall. So only dig your hole as deep as the root ball can sit right on the grade. The picture there in step 1 and step 2, you can see the root flare in those two pictures is buried below the grade. And actually tree roots need 5% or more oxygen around their root system in between waterings. If the root flare is buried too deep, the oxygen levels are going to be too low in the soil around those root systems, and that tree eventually will succumb to a lack of oxygen. It'll be an anaerobic condition. And then the picture there in step 4, the root flare is down in a dished area, and you may have water standing on it, especially in a clay soil area. So we want to make sure that that root flare is at grade or above, but never below grade, where it's going to live for the entirety of its life.
So Donna, you keep mentioning these words, and we just want to make sure we're clear with with people listening. What is the root flare? And you keep saying grade. What kind of grade are we talking about?
Grade is the soil level. So if you're planting it on a berm, you know, grade is the soil surface. You'd never want to plant the tree below soil level, and you can plant it a little high, but at grade is the soil surface of whatever place you're going to plant it on. And the root flare is, if you're looking down on the roots, is where the roots spread from the trunk of the tree. So you should be able to see the roots starting off of the trunk when you're finished planting it. So there where the mouse is moving around in the image, that dark area is the root flare at the top of the root ball. And you should be able to see those roots at the surface when you finish planting. You don't want to bury them like that picture indicates.
So you want that at the soil level, and even maybe a little bit above is better than below.
Never below, yes.
And that's why you don't want to dig that hole deeper than the root ball, right? Because if we put soft soil back in there, it can settle and bring that root flare down. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. So we want the root ball to be stable. When we water it, we don't want it to sink into the hole, and then all that work will eventually put that root system below grade, and then there's not enough oxygen, and eventually the root system will rot in an anaerobic condition.
Perfect. What's next?
So containerized trees, again, they're so easy in the commercial trade, but because those containers basically trap the root system and they have no way out, they begin to circle around inside of those typically plastic containers. We do have pressed paper, pressed peat moss containers. And again, those are man-made. They do somewhat have the reputation because they are biodegradable that you can plant them. And I would say, again, if it's man-made, it has to come out of the hole. Never plant a plant with the container intact.
Even those biodegradable containers, right? They
Yes.
still struggle to break down in our climate, our soils, and in Wyoming.
Yeah, I don't garden in acidic soil, so I don't have experience with acidic soils, but here in Wyoming, remove any kind of container, anything man-made. Again, you want to dig that wide, shallow hole, and you don't want to plant into a hole that has those polished, nearly vertical walls to the hole. And then again, you want to keep the root flare at grade or at the soil level or just above. If you can plant a plant that does not have the circling roots that you see there in step 1 and step 2 on the right hand picture, better. So if you need to do a little root pruning, if you need to slice through those roots to encourage new roots to start where you've cut through root system, all the better, so that the roots have a chance to spread out and not continue to circle around where the container was before you remove that container. So give that root system the opportunity to grow away from and search out water and search out nutrients in its new habitat.
Hey, Donna, would that be the same for the balled and burlapped trees? If they're starting to circle like that, you do the same treatment?
That is a really great question, Micah. Yes, if on the balled and burlapped, if they've been in the burlap long enough, like there was one picture that there was lots of roots that have come through the burlap. Yeah, that picture on the lower left there, if the roots are beginning to grow through the burlap, that you need to cut all that burlap away. And then you may need to do some root pruning. And definitely when you get that root ball into a hole and standing upright, you want to encourage any of the remaining roots to go away from the trunk and away from the center, out radiating from what is the trunk or the center of that hole, so that they will spread out into the soil surrounding that tree, and basically they become the anchor for the tree in the ground for the remainder of its life.
Sure. And when you say root pruning too, just to be clear, you don't mean like cutting off all of the roots of the tree. You mean more breaking them loose so that they're kind of unmatted and able to spread out more. Is that right?
If there's anything broken or damaged, or if it looks like it wants to grow back into the center, you would want to remove those. But most of the time it is encouraging that root system to grow away from rather than back towards the center.
Sure. Thanks.
Thank you. And then staking. Staking is my one thing that I wish we didn't do. And in our windy environment, a lot of people feel like we need to do. But a tree root system should be supportive enough of a tree that we don't need to stake a tree. Our sandier soils may lead to trees tipping over in heavy winds, and we may have winters like this year where a smaller root system is not stable enough to hold a tree up. I prefer to plant without stakes, but I have gotten into the conversation with for instance, our city parks department, they also use the staking to minimize vandalism of the trees in public spaces. So my recommendation for planting is to use 2 stakes, and you need to know the direction of your prevailing wind. So if in this picture the wind is coming from the southeast, for instance, you would want to put the stakes to the southwest and the northeast, so that that tree is still able to sway with the prevailing wind. You don't want the tree so rigid that it can't even move. You want to allow it to sway, and you don't want to anchor it to the ground. You tie the tree to the stakes straight across from itself instead of down to the ground, because you're not trying to hold the tree in the ground. You're trying to allow it to sway and develop an anchoring root system that will stabilize the tree in our wind. But once that tree has been in the ground and the stakes have been on for 1 year, get those stakes off so that the tree will develop anchoring roots and it is able to hold itself up, and it develops the tension wood that allows the tree to sway in the wind while it's holding itself up.
Perfect.
Donna, you and I both live in very windy places, and this is what you and I both recommend. And sometimes we get some really weird looks, like there's no way I believe you, I'm not going to do this. But I just really feel that you have to let them get started on their own, because otherwise, if you leave those on for 4 or 5 years and then you eventually take them off, you just end up with a tree that's too large that can't support itself, and there's no way of getting, you know, stakes and everything big enough to hold it once it's an adult. So
Yeah, and the wood development doesn't catch up with a heavy tree canopy if they're really held up as prisoners in their own landscape. The one thing I didn't mention earlier is you want to make sure the stakes are outside the hole that you dug. So the stakes need to be outside the root ball hole that you dug and into the stabilized soil surrounding the tree. And one of the reasons you don't want to drive the stake into the area that the root ball is in is you don't want to drive that stake right through one of the roots that's going to feed and support the tree. So you want to keep it out of where you know the roots are right now.
So real quick before we move, you mentioned prevailing winds, and I think that was a good analogy, but how do I determine what my prevailing winds are? Because like where I live personally, I get winds from about every direction. So which one's my prevailing wind?
The prevailing wind is the one that's the most common, that on a day-to-day basis, that's where the wind comes from the most often. It's not that once in a winter, twice in a winter storm that comes from an odd direction and it dumps a bunch of snow on you, but it's the one that's most consistent. If nothing else, pay attention to the radio show, the newspaper, whatever it is, wherever you get your weather, and it'll tell you what direction the wind is going to be coming from.
Perfect. So the most common direction and strongest winds, possibly.
Yeah. One thing I will add to a little bit about what Brian was talking about, you know, if anybody's ever had baby chicks or watched a butterfly hatch, you never want to help a baby chick struggle out of the eggshell. They develop their muscles and their vascular system as they're struggling to get out of the shell. Butterflies, the same thing. To get out of the cocoon, they've got to force their wings to fill with the fluids in order to open their wings and be able to fly afterwards. So if we bind up the tree and protect it so much from the wind by making sure that it doesn't ever move in the first year of its life, it will never develop a good strong root system. A butterfly that's assisted or a baby chick that's assisted will never be a healthy creature moving forward. So we don't want to help it so much that we bind it up.
yeah, that's a really good point. Okay. Well, I think we'll keep moving on to fencing now. So as most of us have dealt with this, we may have a similar situation, right? A freshly planted tree that's maybe a year or two old. But the top of it has nice, beautiful leaves, whereas the bottom has been munched on, right? So we have this drastic line of where it wasn't fenced and we had some critters come in and chew on it, this being deer. So some other things to really think about for some of our younger trees or thin bark trees is some of those may be really tempting for like voles that come in during the winter and want to chew on that, especially with, this is an apple tree. So if we have any type of fruit tree, we really want to be making sure we've got something around the base of that trunk to protect them. So you need to have a smaller gap with that fencing, obviously with smaller predators. And then, really to keep, bigger wildlife, elk, deer, moose, you've got to figure out a good fencing system to keep those things away. So, once you have that established, that's really going to help get your tree going. Obviously, find out to where that tree is going to expand. So this fencing will need to be expanded over time as that tree gets bigger. And I don't know about you, Donna, but I feel like sometimes some good fencing also helps prevent issues with humans. So
yeah, it's a great way to deter bad behavior from two-legged and four-legged critters.
yes. So
Well, and I'd throw in there too, Brian. I think that's a perfect, you couldn't say it better, but especially even in our rural locations, we need to have that fenced, right? So if you're out in the country or way out in the boonies, fencing a tree would be beneficial, but especially even for our livestock, right? Keeping horses off of it, cattle off of it, or others. It doesn't always have to be wildlife.
yeah.
We have some demonstration areas here where we have 5 trees planted in a row to demonstrate their windbreak capabilities. And we don't fence individual trees. We'll fence all 5 of those trees together with a very similar fencing material. But whatever it takes to keep the critters out that you have where you are. I was happening to notice on the zone map that we have Pinedale, that area has some of the coldest temperatures, the lowest number on the zone map. And I know Pinedale, DuBois, Jackson, some of those places even have moose. I have absolutely no experience gardening with moose. There are some people in the state that have huge critters that munch on things if they have access to them. So know what the creatures are in your area and do what you got to do to protect the trees from them. Once they get a thicker, corky bark on them, they can somewhat protect themselves for some of that damage. But when they're young and that bark is thin, we got to do what we can to protect from hungry critters that will do damage. And they don't really try. They're not really trying to kill your tree. They're just meeting their own needs.
That's right.
So before we jump, we have a question. How
Okay.
about any tips for gopher deterrent?
Yeah. So that's kind of a tough one. So, we do have a video about trapping gophers on From the Ground Up. That's from the University of Wyoming. I have seen people try and use fencing. They've actually put fencing around the actual root ball, which is not a good idea because then that root ball can't expand, right? As we just were talking about. So thinking about that, you can trap them. It's one of those things that's really tough to actually get rid of. There's things that are out there as far as like gopher getters, which I know in some counties you can rent these things, which are machines that actually you can drag through. If you've got a bigger area, they're not going to work in an urban setting like this tree, for example, but a bigger area where it actually cuts holes through their trenches. And you can actually put poison in that way to take care of them that way. But if you're not into poisoning them, really one of your best methods is probably looking to trap them. So,
well, and if you have a bad gopher problem, you might need both. You might need baits and trapping to get it under control.
Yeah, we have rabbits in our neighborhood, And I think with the gophers above ground, at least, any of the rodents, if you can use a hardware cloth that's got the 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch squares in it, like this picture shows, you could do a fence around the trunk and put a stake in that hardware cloth so that it doesn't abrade the bark of the tree, and then put your larger fence around it to keep the larger wildlife out of the area as well.
Yeah.
Great. Before we move on, one last question at this point. Fencing. So when does that fencing need to come down? You know, you said talked with the staking after a year, we better get it off. For the fence, after a year, after 2, is there any rule or guideline?
It depends on the tree and it depends on what you're trying to keep out. It might be 20 years.
Yeah, I would
Um,
say once the tree has a thicker, corky, kind of chunky bark, it's a little more able to protect itself from damage. But if it continues to grow with a fairly thin bark, you can see there with that apple, it's got some color to it. That bark may be thin enough that it's actually got some pigment in it that's actually photosynthesizing. But if we think about cottonwood trees, you know, the ones that are tearing up the sidewalks, they have a thick, chunky, heavy bark. And if a deer or a moose rubbed its antlers against that bark, it's not going to hurt the tree. But something with as thin a bark as that apple in the picture is now, that those antlers can do a lot of damage.
So yeah, we got a couple questions in the chat box, and I don't know if you want to tackle them now or want to wait for the end. They're both on blue spruce trees.
Yeah, I'll get to the blue spruce with the watering and the winter desiccation here in a minute. Yeah, regarding the ones with, you know, blue spruce that have been eaten, they will come back. So, you know, it just depends on what's happened. But, you know, you can see in a lot of our urban settings where people have cut out the branches, that they actually, you know, you'll see where branches start coming off that trunk, even when they've been, you know, a big branch has been pruned. So they will come back. It just takes a little bit of time. So the
Hold
question
on, Brian.
is, the question
Hold on,
is,
sorry. We
will
just need to
branches on a
repeat the
blue,
question.
will branches on a blue spruce that have been eaten by deer ever grow back? And so the answer is yes. So they will. It just takes some time. Go ahead, Donna.
I'm just with a caveat, if there is still green tissue on that branch, they will grow back. There has to be a bud there for new needles to develop. If they've eaten back into the tree far enough where there's no buds left, where green tissue is growing, they may not fill back in.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, yeah, so a lot of them will recover, which kind of gets us into our next point of watering, because we end up with a lot of trees. I know I go to many trees every summer that have this issue, but watering is one of our big things, right? And so if they have lots of water, they're going to be okay. That really helps things go along. But watering is probably one of our major things we have to think about. Would you not agree, Donna?
Absolutely. I mean, water is our limiting factor here in Wyoming. So if you look across any landscape in Wyoming outside of the city where we have trees, you will see what will grow without water. So if we want to enhance the environment by adding woody ornamentals, trees and shrubs, we have to provide the water that they need to survive our environment. They cannot survive our environment on their own. And there are places where a cottonwood tree will come up all on its own away from the river, but there's probably a source for moisture below ground, a natural spring, or a clay layer that allows water to flow just above the clay layer underground that we don't see in order to provide water for that tree. It won't just grow out amongst the sagebrush and thrive without us supplementing Mother Nature's water supply.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I mean, I think this is kind of a general recommendation that's out there, but we're going to get into this in a little bit more in depth. But during the active growing season, they recommend 5 to 10 gallons every week for every inch of tree diameter 6 inches up the trunk. Okay, so if you count up 6 inches, however thick that diameter is, you need to multiply that. So if you have a 2-inch diameter, you're looking between 10 and 20 gallons per week. And if it's really hot and really windy, it might be a lot more than that. So we're going to go into a little bit more in depth about checking that and watching when that happens. There was the question earlier about what do you do for evergreens that have burned tips, burned needles, that looks dry. We're going to talk about why and how you want to check that.
So blue spruce are native to the mountains of Colorado, where they get upwards of 12 feet of snow in the wintertime. So our mountains may get similar amounts of snow, but down here on the plains, in the valleys where most of our communities are, we don't get nearly as much snowfall. Therefore, we don't have as much precipitation as in the mountains. And those trees need that much water. One way to think of it is any plant is somewhere in the range of 80 to 90% water. And 80 to 90% of a cute little blue spruce, when it's 2-3 foot tall, is, 5 to 10 gallons maybe. But a tree that's 70, 80 foot tall and 30 foot across, 90% of that is a lot of water. And all of those needles are evaporating or transpiring water on a day-to-day basis. And in the heat of summer, when it's 90, 100, 105 degrees, just like us, plants are losing water more rapidly in the heat of summer than they are here, even on a windy day in early spring.
Yeah, and it's really important too to think about that water throughout the entire season, right? So with a lot of our deciduous trees, they're not very active during the winter, fall, spring. But a lot of our evergreens with needles, they're growing, they're active that whole year. So thinking about that is really important. Excuse me. So here we're talking about how we want to make sure that we're having enough water in that soil for plants. Okay. So when the soil is thawed out and plants are growing, we have different amounts of water that can actually be available to these plants that's available through the soil. So this is kind of an interesting chart. But what we really want you to take away from this is, Wyoming tends to have fairly sandy soils. Okay, so we tend to be more on this end of things. But what we want you to look at is the stuff with the bars, right? So you can see that it's not very wide, right? There's not much area here. Whereas we go up this direction towards a more clay soil. Excuse me, I don't know why my voice is going on me. What we're looking at is at what point does the soil dry out and we don't have enough water for plants to have enough water to be healthy. But we also need to think about at what point is there actually those soils can hold, how much water can those soils hold? So we think about a sandy soil. What's really cool is we can get water that infiltrates into those soils really quickly. And what water's there is generally really readily available to plants to uptake. Okay, so they can use a lot of it. But the downside is they just don't hold a whole lot. So they dry out really quickly. So, we think about a 90-degree day, there's a 20-mile-an-hour wind, we have sandy soils, those soils are going to dry out really quickly. Whereas if we have a different texture of soil, they might be able to hold a lot more water. So the point of today is not that you need to go home and know exactly every little bit about this, but hopefully you're doing a soil test to maybe figure out what soil texture you have. And then you can come back to this and know, okay, we did a soil test in Donna's backyard and it came back as a sandy soil. So we know that we're probably going to have to water fairly often. Whereas we went to my backyard and it's more of a silt loam or a clay loam. Okay, Brian's probably not going to have to water quite as often as Donna would need to. But the big difference is when Donna waters, it's going to infiltrate into that soil much quicker. than when Brian does it with his. So we may want to think about a different way to actually water that instead of just sticking a garden hose under a tree where for Donna's backyard, that might work. But for me, it might actually be better, or it might not work, right? We need to think about a different irrigation system. I know I made your head explode with that, but I was just using that as an example, Donna. So that might be kind of a difficult concept perhaps. But the main thing is this can really help you understand what you need. And once you've gone and done a soil test, and you can pick up information on getting your soil tested from your local extension office. A lot of conservation districts can help as well. What you can use is there's some different publications. A cool one that's out there is this one by the NRCS. And basically it's where you can, based on your soil texture, you can grab a bit of that soil, put it in your hand, and how it looks in your hand can give you an estimation of how much water you need to add to your soil to where it's in that mark of this sweet zone, right? Okay, so based on that guide, you may dig something up and you figure, uh-oh, I'm actually below this line and there's not enough water for my trees. So I need to add some water to get it into this sweet spot. So this is a cool guide to help you check that out. So we got the link here. I think Jenny's adding that as well, sending it out to you. So that's pretty cool. So that's a really kind of a cool tip or trick. But Donna has another one I'm going to let her talk about right now for what she can do for going around checking trees. The same deal.
So my method of checking for water is to water your soil no matter where you are. So here in the Casper area near our mountain, soils tend to be kind of clay, and near the river as it goes through the city, soils tend to be pretty sandy. And then north of the river here in Natrona County, basically I'm living on a dormant sand dune. So very, very sandy soil. So if you water your soil for whatever amount of time that you think you normally water for, whether it's 15 minutes or whether it's 40 minutes, water your soil and then either dig a hole or use a long screwdriver. I've actually bought a screwdriver that's a foot long, plus the handle, and you can push the screwdriver into the soil rather easily when the soil is wet. If the soil is dry, especially in a clay soil, when you get to the dry layer, it's like hitting concrete. That screwdriver is not going to go anywhere when you hit the dry layer. So you want to find out how deep your moisture is going with your watering. So for instance, if you've been watering for 30 minutes and you get that screwdriver in about 7 inches, it's not quite deep enough for watering trees and shrubs. It's probably deep enough for watering just a lawn, but where you've got trees and shrubs in that lawn area, you probably want to water for a little bit more time. So water some more and you find out that you've gone down 10 to 12 inches with that screwdriver. Then you know that you've got enough water on that you have water around most of the root system. And then you figure out that you've watered for, say, 47 minutes when you finally get it down deep enough. So every time you water, you want to water for 47, maybe 50 minutes. And then you wait until the top inch or two of soil dries out, and then it's time to water again. So this time of the year, you may water once a month, once every 3 weeks. And then as we get into May and June, it may be a couple times a month, couple times, couple 2 or 3 times a month. Then as we get into July and August, you may be watering as much as every other day when we have the heat that we had last summer. It was pretty intense heat in the heat of summer. And then again, tapering off to less and less frequently in the fall when it cools off. But the key is to water the same amount of time every time you water, because your soil is the same, whether it's April or August or October.
Thanks, Donna. And I think that kind of answers a question about, with how much snow that's currently on the ground, do we need to worry about watering? And You know, if you've got some good snow cover, generally we don't need to worry about it. It's that, you know, late November time when it's not really been freezing that hard. Late October, early November, somewhere in there. And that soil surface has not frozen yet. And it's really dry and windy. You know, those are some critical times you still need to think about. So yeah, it's really
So
important.
my rule of thumb with watering in the winter is anytime the temperatures are above 40, 45 degrees, if we don't have snow cover, there's nothing melting, percolating into the soil, and we get up to those warmer temperatures, it's a good time to drag out the garden hose. I also recommend, which is a caveat here in Wyoming, of not watering when it's windy. So when it's 40 to 45 degrees and the wind's not blowing, put a sprinkler on the hose and water those trees. But if the wind is blowing 40 miles an hour and it's getting up into the 50s, you probably need to get some water on the trees, even though the wind's blowing.
Yeah, very good call. So yeah, we're gonna keep talking about watering here for a few more minutes, get through some fertilizing, and then we'll wrap it up here so we're not too over time. But really the importance for all these things, why we're talking about watering, is it really prevents issues that happen with insects, diseases, and winter injury. So, you know, lots of times we might see a drip system and we have one dripper that goes to the base of a tree. But if we really think about the tree's root systems, they're really shallow and they probably spread out quite a ways. So really thinking about ways that we can reach this entire root zone is really important. So drip systems work. We just want to make sure we've got lots of emitters or lots of ways to reach all of that. Soaker hoses can do that as well. Sprinkler systems. We want to make sure that with sprinklers, we're not spraying too much of the leaves if possible, because that can cause some issues with disease, which we won't get into, but that can happen. There's also this thing called root needling, which is for really deep tap-rooted trees. We tend to not have a lot of those, so you may hear of that, but there's just not a ton of that happens. And Donna may want to speak to that more if she wants, but
Yeah. So people tend to think of oaks as deep rooted, because when an oak sprouts from an acorn, it sends out a taproot system. So this image here, if you follow the line straight down from the trunk, you have one root that's kind of going almost straight down. But eventually the tree stops putting energy into that taproot system and starts branching, just like the tree sends up a trunk, and it doesn't just keep sending a trunk straight up into the air. It begins to branch and branch and branch. In the upward direction, it branches so that it can grow lots more leaves so it can photosynthesize more. In the downward direction, it's searching for water. And so it doesn't just keep going straight down, searching for water in the deeper levels of water or the soil, because eventually the soil is depleted of oxygen, and without oxygen, then we have root decay. So eventually the root system also starts branching in all directions around the trunk of the tree. So it actually stays fairly shallow, and research has shown that tree roots spread 3 to 5 times the height of the tree. So when you plant that tree, you know where the root system is. You just inspected the entire root system and then covered it with soil. It didn't all of a sudden spread out from there. It takes a few years for that growth to happen. But after the tree begins to grow, once it's established, you can estimate that the root system is anywhere from 3 to 5 times the height of that tree. So where we get large cottonwood trees in neighborhoods, you may be watering the roots of the neighbor 3 houses down, and then the neighbor across the alley or across the street may actually be watering the roots that are watering your tree. So watering is a really good thing to do for all of the trees in the neighborhood. But because the tree roots spread out, and we know they're not right up next to the trunk of the tree, putting a needle or a deep root waterer in the ground next to the trunk of the tree is basically filling the aquifer. That tree is taking up water at the ends of the roots where the little one-celled root hairs are. And those are at the ends of the roots, not up near the trunk of the tree. So as the trees mature, laying the garden hose at the base of the tree and turning the hose on really isn't watering the tree. You've got to get that water out away from the trunk of the tree. And if you think about in a rainstorm, if you're around trees, you're going to run under the tree because it doesn't get wet under the tree. The tree drops all the water out beyond the leaves to where the roots can take up that water and the tree can benefit from the water. It doesn't put water right at the trunk of the tree. So the tree spreads that water out to where it will benefit from it out beyond the drip line of the tree. So the drip line is where the branches end and the water would drip off of those branches onto the ground. So you want to water from the drip line out once that tree reaches some size.
Perfect, yeah. And speaking of that, there's some other crucial areas we want to watch out for. So, if you're by, might have shrubs that are near buildings or eaves, right, that have really hot afternoon exposure. They may dry out more rapidly, right? Mounds or berms, right? We tend to see these in landscaping lots of times. We want to plant stuff on those. So this is a good example of a berm. We've got a spruce tree that's in a sandy soil. Obviously, it's probably not getting a ton of water. So we really need to think about some of these spots that can dry out really quickly. This is a really good example of one that might have issues with winter dieback, water stress, and will be more prone to insect and disease issues.
It's kind of interesting in landscaping. If a landscaper is designing a landscape for a flat area, they want to build a mound or a berm. And if they're designing a landscape for the side of a hill, then they want to flatten everything. So we all seem to change the landscape that we're working on to make it more interesting, right? And so that adds to the complication of how do we care for the plants once we have them in the ground.
Yep. And one of those ways to help them, Donna, obviously, is to put some mulch down. This can be a natural material. We can also use some rocks. But basically the idea is we have something that helps prevent soil moisture loss, okay, things from evaporating. So generally we want a couple inches of that, 2 to 4 inches. We want to keep it away from the base of the tree. These are examples of too little, and this is an example of too much and maybe not the right material that we're using. We want it to be smaller material than some of the chunks of wood that are in this one. And this one, we can obviously see how this is drying out really quickly, right? We only have a single emitter to provide water. So this is a tree that's going to dry out really quickly.
So one thing to add to that is, remember we talked about early on, we're not going to amend the soil with organic matter to start with. So if you're using organic matter as your mulch, as the worms and the microbes and the rabbits and the squirrels dig in and around your tree, they will actually begin to mix some of that organic matter that degrades from your mulch into the soil, which will improve the soil over time. So by adding an organic mulch and then replenishing that every few years, you'll continue to improve the soil over time because of the organic matter that biodegrades under that tree.
Yep.
Just like happens in a forest.
Yep. Yeah, it's really important. So if you have more questions on mulching, we have a really great article from Barnyards and Backyards that goes into all the specifics for that, but something you really want to think about. Okay, so we also have some fertilizing stuff we'll go through here. We'll finally get to one of the questions that was asked. Strategies for fertilizing established spruce trees and pines. So go ahead, Donna.
Yeah, one thing this picture reminds me of is tree growers refer to grass as green death. So this picture where we have the tree fenced in and there's beautiful lush grass growing underneath it, one of the best reasons to mulch that tree is to keep the grass at bay. So a researcher years ago did some research on what microbes grow in the soil on the plains or in meadows. and what microbes grow around tree roots in forests. And trees prefer to grow or thrive in soils that have fungal organisms in the soil. And grasses or meadows tend to thrive in soils that have bacteria growing in the soil. So the two of them actually are not great neighbors. And green grass will actually suppress the growth of young trees. So keeping that grass at bay under a tree is going to give your tree a much better start than that particular tree in that image. So fertilizing is something we don't want to continue to give trees so much nutrient that we're causing lush growth to grow, especially late in the season, which makes them susceptible to freezes and frosts on that tender new growth on a regular basis. We want to encourage some healthy growth, and we want to supplement nutrients that might be missing from the soil that we're growing in. We do realize that the plant in the picture is not a tree, that's a strawberry, but it's a good indicator of the fact that this soil and that particular site is iron deficient, where you can see the bright green veins and the rest of the leaf or the leaf blade is yellowing, almost white on the center of that one leaf. It is not getting enough iron to support growth in that particular plant. So we want to know what nutrients are in our soil. So we do recommend you get a soil test and supplement for the needs of the plants based on the soil you're growing in. So most often in Wyoming, you're going to need some nitrogen, which is what grows green leafy tissue. And then you're going to need some micronutrients. But in an area where you need nitrogen, if they recommend somewhere in the range of 1 to 3 pounds per 1,000 square feet, you never want to put that all on in one application. You want to do 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet in an individual application. So you might do that early in spring, as soon as you can get out onto the site once the snow melts off. Even if we're going to get more snow on top of that fertilizer, it'll help get percolated into the ground. And then once early in the summer, before we get too much heat in the spring and early summer, and then maybe at the end of the growing season to put the plant into winter on a healthy footing. We would do one more application. You just want to make sure that you do that before September 15th so that we don't get that lush growth that becomes susceptible to some of those first frosts in the fall.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think really going back to thinking about some water that can be added to it in the springtime is really important. So kind of watching when that's going to happen is critical. So.
One key there on Brian's notes is never, preference is not to use the herbicide combination with fertilizer. So weed and feed is detrimental to the broadleaf plants in the landscape. So when you have a tree growing up out of the middle of your lawn, that is a broadleaf plant. And if you have an herbicide in that nutrient supplement for your plants, that herbicide can negatively affect the trees that happen to be taking up their nutrient from the soil under the lawn. So if you only have a lawn, that's one thing, but most instances in a landscape, there's going to be broadleaf plants in the lawn. So that herbicide is basically a contaminant for the broadleaf plants. So we really do recommend using herbicide where you need it and putting fertilizer on plants that need it. So this particular picture is one way that fertilizer can be applied. And again, I don't like that system because there's no way of knowing whether there's a giant root right under any one of those pinholes at a 2-foot spacing under the tree. So you never know whether your needle is going to go right into a main root, whether it's going to sever one-celled root hairs on the tips of a new root. If it's someplace that a rodent has severed the root and now there's new root growth growing. So trees can take up the nutrient that's applied to the soil surface just like you do with your lawn fertilizer. So there's no need to drive yourself crazy trying to figure out 2-foot spacings and poking holes in the ground and hoping that you're missing the root system. I just say put your fertilizer down with a spreader just like you would on your lawn. And then moisture will take it down into the deeper layers of the soil, and the root system will take it up as it takes up water.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, with any of these things, as we're talking about, we talked about the iron, right? We may have some other issues that are happening based on our soil pH. So just keep in mind, just because you're fertilizing and you get leaves that aren't the right color or things look off still, you may have something else that's happening. But again, going back to that soil test, that'll give you some good information related to something like this. So we're not going to go all the way through this, but just to keep that in mind. And then we just wanted to finish things up by talking about, you know, for some of you that are on this call today, you may be living in either urban or rural area. So if you're in one of those more rural areas and you're worried about, you know, the potential of wildfire, this is a good guide you can go through for selecting species and how far apart should have your trees and how close those trees should be to buildings before you plant them. So if you have any questions, this is a guide you can go talk to. So
if you are in a fire prone area or an area that hasn't had a fire in quite some time, and your home is in the forest, you want to make sure that you maintain that defensible space so that firefighters can get in and get out safely. We don't want to subject them to life-threatening situations more than they already are, but so that your homestead, your house, your outbuildings are defensible.
So with that, Jeremiah and Micah, I think we can take any remaining questions. Apologize, we've gone over a little bit, but hopefully that was useful for folks.
These are important.
These are important, so.
I can't hear you, Micah. No, that was great, guys. Thank you so much. I think the information is fantastic. At this point, I don't see any outstanding questions or anything. And since Mike is having some technical difficulties, I'll just kind of wrap us up here. And so thank you everyone for joining us. We have other Barnyards and Backyards live shows that we have recorded specifically on the topic of like wildfires and defending your spaces. So please look into that. You can look at the schedule and what has been done and recorded and archived, but also what we have still remaining for this spring. So check out the Barnyards and Backyards Live website. Look at all those great shows that we have coming up. Stay tuned in. We really appreciate everybody coming. Brian and Donna also mentioned to reach out to your local extension office. We have an extension office in every county and one on the Wind River Indian Reservation. So look those up. Reach out to them. Those people can also help you connect to those other resources that Donna and Brian talked about in your county. So maybe the conservation districts or the state forestry services or anything that way. They are also there and available to help you or hopefully answer your individual questions. Like Brian said, the pruning, the insects, the diseases that we didn't cover today. And then last but not least, we want to hear from you. We do these shows and this program for you. And so we would like to hear from you. And so we put a survey into the comments box on Facebook and then the chat box here on Zoom. So if you have a chance, please click on that link. Doesn't take very long. And it gives us feedback on how we're doing and what else we can do to try and provide some information to you. With that, I want to say thank you again for joining us. Thank you to our guests, Brian and Donna. Thank you so much. Micah, Jenny, everybody. We really appreciate it. It was a good show. Thank you guys. Have a good one.